Hello, Math 3. Welcome to Lesson 1.2b. We're going to be talking about the empirical rule for normal distributions. So we're going to take all that shading that we were doing on our last lesson, and we're going to push it a little further and see if we can determine percentages on our normal distribution curves. So let's start off with the rules. I got a couple of rules for you, and they're real simple. First of all, they're also a little mind-blowing. About 68% of the data in a normal distribution is within one standard deviation of the mean. So it's within -1 sigma to +1 sigma. It's quite a lot of your information clustered around the mean. About 95% of the data in a normal distribution is within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So 95% of your data is going to be between -2 sigma and +2 sigma. And this one's crazy. 99.7% of the data in a normal distribution is within 3 standard deviations of the mean. So from -3 sigma to +3 sigma, you've got almost all of your data, not quite, but you've got 99.7% of it. So to give you an idea visually, 68% of your data is going to be within 1 standard deviation. 95% of your data is going to be within 2 standard deviations, and 99.7 is going to be within 3 standard deviations of your data. Now, that does mean there's a 0.3% between these two little bits hanging off the end. There's always going to be a weirdo here and there, but most of your data is going to be between -3 sigma and +3 sigma. The easiest way to kind of sum it all up is with this diagram right here. I would really recommend writing down this diagram, drawing it out, memorizing it, cherish it, love it, do whatever you have to do to know this and to know this well. It will be so helpful for you. So we said within 1 standard deviation of the mean is 68%. Within 2 standard deviations of the mean is 95%. And within 3 standard deviations of the mean, it's going to be 99.7%. Not quite everybody, but really, really close. So let's use this information to help us find percentages of chunks of the data. So I would recommend that the first thing you do on these problems is that you shade the region underneath the normal curve so you know what you're looking at, and then look back at your diagram for the empirical rule to see if you can use it to help you figure out what percent that you are looking at. So we're starting off with the percent of adult males with a height between 62 inches and 74 inches. Hit pause to try this out, and then hit play when you're ready to check your work. So the first thing I did is I shaded this thing. 62 inches to 74 inches. I shaded it, which means I'm going from -2 sigma to +1 sigma. So my first thought was this. My first thought was that I know -2 sigma to +1 sigma, +2 sigma. I know that this is all 95%. But I kind of had a little thought here, like, well, what if I break this up into chunks? So I'm going to put, oh, that's a bad line. You can't see it well. I'm going to put a line right at my mean. So I know from -2 to +2 is 95%. And I'm going to cut it in half just to get that piece of it. So 95%, cut it in half, which gives me, what, 47.5%? And that should give me just this chunk here. But what about this chunk over here? Well, I know that from -1 sigma to +1 sigma is 68%. So I'm going to take my 68%, and I only want this half of it, so I'm going to cut it in half, which gives me 34%. So I know this chunk is 34%. I know this chunk is 47.5%. So if I add them together, that tells me that about 81.5% of adult males have a height between 62 and 74 inches. This is not the only way you could have solved this problem. This is a way to solve it. This is just the first thing my brain went for. Keep in mind there are other ways you could have attacked this as well. So try this one out. What percent of adult females are taller than 68.5 inches? Again, I would recommend shading it in first and then seeing what you could do with it. So hit pause to try it out and then hit play when you're ready to check your work. So I want to know the percent of females taller than 68.5%. So I'm going to shade everything to the right of that 68.5. Now, if I want to know the percent, well, I know the whole thing is 100. So let me give this some thought. So that means this half would be 50%, right? If the whole thing is 100%, from the mean to the right is 50%, but I want to subtract out that little chunk. Get my pen out. So I want to subtract out this chunk here, right? So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, I know 100% is the whole thing. I know that from -1 to +1 is 68%. So how about if I subtract that out of my 100%, which gives me 32%. The only thing is, when I did that, that 32% not only includes this shaded part, doesn't that mean it would include this part at the bottom as well? And I don't want that side, I only want this side. So I'm going to cut that 32% in half, and that means that about 16% of adult females are taller than 68.5 inches. Cool. So let's try this one. What percent of history test scores are between 63 points and 70 points? As always, hit pause to try it out and then hit play when you're ready to check your work. So the first thing I did, I shaded it in, right? 63 to 70. I shaded it in. There it is. And it looks like it's from 0 to 1 sigma. Well, I know from my empirical rule that -1 sigma to +1 sigma is 68%. However, I only want this half of it, so I'm going to cut it in half, which tells me that about 34% of the history test scores are between 63 points and 70 points. I hope you found this helpful. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to email me. Come see me Tuesdays or Thursdays after school. Do what you gotta do, and I'll see you soon. Bye.